Alice Brennan had been 32 years old in March of 1885 when she'd filed a homestead claim in western Nebraska as a widow whose husband Frank had died suddenly in February, leaving her with almost nothing except the 12-gauge shotgun he'd owned and the plan they'd made together to prove land under the Homestead Act. Alice's situation had been desperate in ways that would have discouraged most people from attempting homesteading. She'd possessed approximately $15 in cash, minimal household goods, no livestock, no farming equipment beyond basic hand tools, and no family or close connections who could provide assistance or support during the difficult years that proving a claim would require. The shotgun Frank had left behind had been a Stevens double-barrel 12-gauge that he'd purchased used for approximately $18 several years earlier, and it had been among the few items of value Alice had inherited when Frank had died. The weapon had come with approximately 30 shells that Frank had owned, and Alice had known that at 50 cents for a box of 25 shells, replacing ammunition would be expensive enough that she would need to make every shot count if she was going to use the shotgun for hunting or for any other purpose that consumed the precious cartridges. Alice had learned to shoot during her childhood in Iowa, where her father had taught her and her brothers basic marksmanship and hunting skills that had been considered practical education for children growing up in rural areas where game hunting had supplemented family food supplies. She'd been competent with a shotgun, though not exceptional, and she'd understood the basics of hunting small game and of maintaining and cleaning firearms to keep them functional. The skills had seemed merely useful during her youth, but in March of 1885, as she'd contemplated homesteading alone with no resources except a shotgun and minimal cash, those childhood lessons had represented the difference between realistic survival and certain failure. The homestead claim Alice had filed had been the same quarter section that Frank had been planning to claim before his death, located approximately 18 miles northwest of the town of McCook in Red Willow County. Frank had selected the location during a scouting trip several months earlier, and he'd identified a section that included a small spring that would provide reliable water and that possessed soil suitable for wheat and corn cultivation. Alice had never seen the land before filing the claim because women hadn't typically accompanied men on preliminary scouting expeditions, but she'd trusted Frank's judgment about the location and she'd proceeded with filing based on his assessment. The journey from McCook to the homestead site had required most of a day walking with the few possessions Alice had been able to carry, and when she'd arrived at the quarter section that was now legally hers to prove over the next 5 years, she'd confronted the reality of what homesteading alone would require. The land had been unimproved prairie with no structures, no broken sod, no indication that any human had ever attempted to settle there permanently. Everything would need to be built from materials gathered on site, or purchased with money Alice didn't have, and every improvement would need to be accomplished through her own labor, without help from neighbors who'd been scattered thinly across the region and who'd been focused on their own proving efforts. Alice's first priority had been constructing shelter that would protect her from weather and that would satisfy the Homestead Act's requirement for residence on the claim. She'd possessed neither the money to purchase lumber for a frame cabin, nor the physical strength to handle the heavy timber that cabin construction would have required for a woman working alone. The practical solution had been to build a dugout excavated into a low hillside near the spring, and Alice had begun the exhausting work of digging into the earth to create an underground chamber that would serve as her home. The dugout construction had required approximately 3 weeks of sustained labor during April of 1885, with Alice working from dawn until exhaustion had forced her to stop each day. The excavation had been physically brutal work for someone who'd never performed heavy manual labor, and Alice's hands had developed blisters that had become calluses as she'd shoveled thousands of cubic feet of earth to create a chamber approximately 12 feet by 14 feet with a ceiling height of 6.5 feet. The dimensions had been smaller than she'd have preferred, but they'd been adequate for a single person, and they'd been manageable for someone working alone without equipment or assistance. The roof of the dugout had been constructed using small cottonwood poles Alice had cut from trees growing along a creek, approximately half a mile from the homestead site. The poles had been laid across the excavation to create a basic roof frame, and these had been covered with prairie grass and then with approximately 12 inches of earth to create insulation and waterproofing. The roof construction had been crude but functional, and it had provided adequate protection from rain and snow, even if it had been far less sophisticated than the heavy timber and thick sod roofs that experienced builders created for permanent dugout dwellings. By early May of 1885, Alice's dugout had been sufficiently complete to provide basic shelter, and she'd been able to turn her attention to the critical problem of how to feed herself through the coming months when she would need to break sod and plant crops while having no income and no food stores, beyond the minimal supplies her $15 could purchase. The obvious solution had been to use Frank's shotgun to hunt game that could supplement the bread and beans that represented the core of her diet, and Alice had begun hunting with the recognition that ammunition was expensive enough that she couldn't afford to waste shells on poor shots or on game that was too difficult to hit reliably. The first hunting Alice had attempted had been for rabbits that were abundant on the prairie, and that represented relatively easy targets for someone with basic shooting skills. Cottontail rabbits had been common enough that Alice could typically find opportunities for shots within walking distance of her dugout, and the meat from a single rabbit had been sufficient to provide protein for 2 or 3 meals when combined with bread or beans. Alice had taught herself to be selective about shots, waiting for rabbits to be within perhaps 20 or 30 yards, and in clear positions where a miss was unlikely before pulling the trigger. The discipline of making every shot count had been essential because ammunition had been expensive, relative to Alice's extremely limited budget, and wasting shells on missed shots would have meant reducing the total number of hunting opportunities before money ran out completely. At 50 cents for 25 shells, each cartridge had cost 2 cents, and missing a shot had meant throwing away money Alice couldn't afford to waste. The economic pressure had made Alice a more careful hunter than she'd been as a child when ammunition had seemed abundant, because her father had been purchasing it rather than Alice paying from her own scarce resources. Beyond rabbits, Alice had hunted prairie chickens that had been common in the grasslands and that had provided larger amounts of meat than rabbits while still being reasonable targets for shotgun hunting. Prairie chickens had typically been found in small flocks, and careful stalking had sometimes allowed Alice to position herself for shots that had taken multiple birds with a single barrel, maximizing the efficiency of ammunition use. A successful prairie chicken hunt that had resulted in 3 or 4 birds had been providing enough meat for a week or more, and such hunts had been rare enough triumphs that Alice had remembered each one as a significant success. The most valuable game Alice had hunted had been deer, which had been less common than rabbits or prairie chickens, but which had provided far more meat when successfully taken. A single deer had been yielding perhaps 80 to 100 pounds of meat that could be preserved through drying or smoking, and a successful deer hunt had been representing food security for weeks or even months, depending on how carefully Alice had rationed the preserved meat. But deer hunting had been more challenging than small game hunting because deer had been warier and had required more careful stalking, and because the heavier shot loads needed for deer had been costing slightly more than the lighter loads Alice had been using for rabbits and birds. Alice's success at hunting during the spring and summer of 1885 had been adequate to keep her from starving, but it had been far from abundant living, and she'd been constantly aware that every meal containing meat had been representing ammunition expended and had been reducing the finite number of shots remaining before she would need to purchase more shells with money she didn't have. By midsummer, Alice had been down to approximately 15 shells from the 30 she'd started with, and she'd been facing the reality that she would need to find ways to obtain either money or ammunition before hunting season had continued much longer. The solution Alice had developed had been to begin trading fresh game meat to neighbors who'd been willing to exchange flour, beans, salt, or other supplies for rabbits or prairie chickens that Alice had been hunting. The barter economy that had existed among frontier homesteaders had been making such trades practical, and Alice had discovered that fresh meat had been valuable enough that she could obtain supplies worth perhaps 5 or 10 cents in exchange for a rabbit that had cost her 2 cents in ammunition to obtain. The margin had been narrow, but it had been sufficient to allow Alice to extend her resources and to begin accumulating a small surplus of supplies that had provided minimal security against unexpected shortages. One neighbor named Walter Kemp, who'd been homesteading approximately 4 miles from Alice's claim with his wife Louise, had been particularly generous in trading supplies for game meat, and he'd been among the first people to comment favorably on Alice's hunting skills and on her determination to survive, despite circumstances that would have defeated many people. Walter had visited Alice's dugout in July of 1885 to deliver flour he'd promised, in exchange for prairie chickens Alice had provided, and during the visit, he'd expressed admiration for what Alice had been accomplishing alone. "Mrs. Brennan, I've been homesteading for 3 years now, and I've seen plenty of people fail because they couldn't adapt to conditions out here. But I'll be honest with you, I didn't think you'd last a month when I heard you'd filed a claim alone with nothing but your late husband's shotgun. The fact that you're not just surviving but actually hunting successfully and building a decent dugout is remarkable. You're tougher than most men I know, and you ought to be proud of what you've accomplished." Alice had appreciated Walter's words, even while recognizing that his surprise at her success had been reflecting assumptions about women's capabilities that had been common among frontier men. "Mr. Kemp, I appreciate your kind words, but I don't feel particularly tough or remarkable. I feel exhausted and scared most of the time, and I'm constantly worried that I'll run out of ammunition or that I'll get injured and won't be able to hunt or work. But I don't have any choice except to keep going, because the alternative is giving up and going back to Iowa with nothing, and I'm not willing to do that. Frank and I plan to prove this claim together, and even though he's gone, I'm going to finish what we started." The mention of Frank had been prompting Walter to ask about Alice's late husband and about the circumstances of his death, and Alice had provided the explanation she'd been giving to anyone who'd asked, that Frank had died in an accident in February of 1885, shortly before they'd been planning to travel to Nebraska to file their homestead claim. The details Alice had provided had been vague, because she herself had known relatively few specifics about Frank's death, which had occurred while Frank had been away from their home in Iowa on business he'd been conducting alone. The agricultural work Alice had been accomplishing during her first growing season had been minimal compared to what experienced farmers with proper equipment and animal power had been achieving. But it had been respectable for someone working alone with only hand tools and no previous farming experience. Alice had managed to break approximately 8 acres of prairie sod during May and June using a spade and a grubbing hoe, and she'd planted the broken ground with wheat and corn seed she'd purchased with a portion of her initial $15. The harvest Alice had brought in during September of 1885 had been modest, yielding approximately 25 bushels of wheat and 15 bushels of corn from the 8 acres she'd cultivated. The yields had been well below what established farmers had been achieving on broken ground with proper cultivation, but they'd been adequate to provide seed for the following year's planting and to generate perhaps $12 in income from grain sold in McCook. The $12 combined with the value of game meat Alice had been hunting and the supplies she'd been accumulating through barter had been barely sufficient to support her through the winter, but barely sufficient had been enough to avoid starvation and to allow Alice to continue proving her claim. The winter of 1885 to 1886 had been Alice's first test of whether she could survive months of cold weather in a crude dugout with minimal resources and with hunting as her primary source of protein. The dugout had been providing adequate protection from wind and extreme cold, thanks to the insulating effect of the earth surrounding it, but the interior had been dark and cramped and had become oppressively confining during long winter days when outdoor work had been impossible, and when Alice had been forced to remain inside with nothing to occupy her time except basic household tasks and maintenance of her limited possessions. The psychological challenge of winter isolation had been more difficult than Alice had anticipated, and there had been days when the loneliness and the constant worry about running out of food or ammunition had been overwhelming enough that she'd questioned whether continuing to prove the claim had been worth the hardship and uncertainty. But each time doubts had threatened to convince her to abandon the homestead, Alice had reminded herself that returning to Iowa would mean admitting failure and would mean that Frank's death had been meaningless, and the determination to finish what they'd started together had been sufficient to sustain her through the darkest periods of isolation and fear. The shotgun had remained central to Alice's survival through the winter, providing rabbits and occasional prairie chickens that had been supplementing the wheat and corn she'd harvested and the limited supplies she'd been able to purchase or trade for. By spring of 1886, Alice had been down to perhaps 20 shells remaining from the original 30, plus the few she'd been able to obtain through trades, and she'd been facing the reality that she would need to find ways to purchase more ammunition soon, or would be losing her primary source of protein and her ability to trade for necessary supplies. The second growing season Alice had attempted during the spring and summer of 1886 had been more successful than her first year's agricultural work, partly because she'd gained experience and understanding of local conditions, and partly because she'd been able to expand her cultivation to approximately 12 acres by breaking additional sod during April and May. The increased acreage had been requiring more seed and more labor, but it had been providing potential for larger harvest that would generate more income and would improve Alice's financial security if weather and growing conditions had been favorable. The harvest of 1886 had been yielding approximately 40 bushels of wheat and 25 bushels of corn, representing improved yields per acre compared to the previous year and generating approximately $22 in income after reserving seed for future planting. The additional income had been allowing Alice to purchase 2 boxes of shotgun shells, 50 cartridges total, that had been replenishing her ammunition supply and had been ensuring that hunting could continue to provide meat and trading opportunities. By the autumn of 1886, Alice had been approaching the end of her second year of homesteading, with the recognition that she'd been succeeding at proving her claim despite circumstances that had seemed nearly impossible when she'd started. The community's initial skepticism about a widow trying to homestead alone with nothing but a shotgun had been gradually transforming into respect for Alice's determination and competence, and several neighbors had begun treating her as a legitimate homesteader rather than as a charity case who would inevitably fail. The winter of 1886 to 1887 had been Alice's second winter on the claim, and while it had been physically easier than the first winter, thanks to better food security and improved dugout conditions, it had been psychologically challenging in different ways as Alice had begun confronting questions about what her long-term future would look like if she successfully completed her proving period. Would she continue farming alone indefinitely? Would she eventually remarry and share the homestead with a new husband? Would she sell the proven claim and use the proceeds to start a different life elsewhere? The questions had been abstract enough that Alice hadn't needed to answer them immediately, but they'd been occupying her thoughts during long winter evenings when there had been little to do except maintain the fire and think about the future. The shotgun that had been hanging on the dugout wall had been serving as a constant reminder of Frank and of the life they'd planned together that had been cut short by his death, and Alice had sometimes found herself talking to the weapon as though it could somehow connect her to the husband she'd lost. In February of 1887, approximately 2 years after Frank's death and nearly 2 years into Alice's proving period, an event occurred that would transform her understanding of her past and would force her to reconsider everything she'd believed about her marriage and about Frank's character. A letter had arrived at the McCook post office addressed to Mrs. Frank Brennan, or occupant of Brennan Homestead claim. And when Alice had traveled to town to collect her mail, the postmaster had handed her an envelope that had been posted from Iowa and that had been bearing a return address she hadn't recognized. Alice had opened the letter while still in the post office, expecting perhaps correspondence from a distant relative or news about estate matters related to Frank's death. But the content of the letter had been shocking enough that Alice had needed to sit down on the bench outside the post office to finish reading it, and by the time she'd reached the end, she'd been trembling with emotions she couldn't immediately identify. Anger, confusion, disbelief, and a growing sense that everything she'd thought she'd known about Frank might have been built on lies. The letter Alice had been reading on the bench outside the McCook post office in February of 1887 had been written by a man who'd identified himself as Thomas Brennan, Frank's older brother, who'd been living in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Alice had never met Thomas and had known very little about Frank's family beyond vague mentions that Frank had made during their marriage about having relatives in Iowa whom he'd been estranged from due to unspecified family disagreements. The tone of Thomas's letter had been formal and businesslike, rather than sympathetic or friendly, and the content had been revealing information about Frank that Alice had never suspected, and that called into question everything she'd believed about her marriage. Thomas had written that he'd been attempting to locate Frank for more than a year, regarding debts Frank had owed to multiple creditors in Cedar Rapids, and regarding legal matters that Thomas hadn't specified in detail, but that he'd described as serious enough to warrant criminal prosecution if Frank had been found. Thomas had learned of Frank's death through inquiries he'd been making with mutual acquaintances, and he'd been writing to Alice to determine whether Frank had left any assets that could be used to satisfy the outstanding debts he'd accumulated before leaving Iowa in early 1885. But the most shocking content in Thomas's letter had been his revelation that Frank had been married to another woman named Grace Peterson when he'd married Alice in September of 1883. According to Thomas, Frank had married Grace in Cedar Rapids in June of 1878, and the marriage had produced one child, a daughter born in 1879. Frank had abandoned Grace and the child in August of 1882, leaving Cedar Rapids without informing Grace of his intentions or his destination, and Grace had been left to support herself and the child alone, while having no legal grounds for divorce, because abandonment hadn't been considered sufficient cause under Iowa law as it had existed at that time. Thomas had written that Frank's marriage to Alice in 1883 had therefore been bigamous and legally void, because Frank had still been legally married to Grace at the time. The letter had included the date and location of Frank's marriage to Grace, and Thomas had suggested that Alice could verify the information through county marriage records in Cedar Rapids if she doubted his account. Thomas had also written that Grace had eventually obtained a divorce from Frank in absentia in 1886, after Iowa law had been changed to allow divorce on grounds of willful desertion, and that Grace had remarried shortly afterward to a man who'd been willing to accept both her and her daughter. The practical implication of Thomas's revelations had been that Alice's marriage to Frank had never been legally valid, which meant that Alice was not actually Frank's widow and had no legal claim to any assets or property Frank might have owned at the time of his death. Thomas had written that he was not seeking any compensation from Alice for Frank's debts, because he understood that Alice had been deceived by Frank and could not reasonably be held responsible for obligations she'd never known existed. But Thomas had wanted Alice to know the truth about Frank's past because he'd believed she deserved to understand the man she'd thought she'd married. Alice had sat on the bench outside the post office for perhaps 20 minutes after finishing Thomas's letter, trying to process information that had been fundamentally altering her understanding of her own identity and her recent past. If Frank had been married to Grace when he'd married Alice, then Alice's marriage had been a lie, and Alice had been living as Frank's wife for nearly 2 years while being nothing more than an unknowing participant in Frank's bigamy. The realization that Frank had deceived her so completely had been creating emotions Alice struggled to identify. She'd felt simultaneously betrayed, humiliated, angry, and strangely relieved that Frank's death had prevented him from continuing the deception indefinitely. The walk back from McCook to her homestead had taken most of the afternoon, and during the 18-mile journey, Alice had been replaying conversations with Frank in her mind, searching for signs she should have noticed that he'd been hiding something significant about his past. Had there been moments when Frank had seemed evasive about his life before meeting Alice? Had he avoided discussing family or previous relationships in ways that should have raised suspicions? Looking back with the knowledge Thomas's letter had provided, Alice could identify occasions when Frank had changed subjects, when Alice had asked about his past, or when he'd provided answers that had been vague enough to avoid specifics, while seeming to satisfy Alice's curiosity. But at the time those conversations had occurred, Alice had interpreted Frank's reluctance to discuss his past as normal male reticence rather than as deliberate concealment of a wife and child he'd abandoned. She'd been in love with Frank and had wanted to believe the best about him, and that combination of affection and trust had made her blind to warning signs that might have been obvious to someone more skeptical or more experienced with dishonest men. The recognition that she'd been deceived, not through any particular cleverness on Frank's part, but rather through her own willingness to accept his stories without questioning them, had been adding humiliation to the anger and betrayal Alice had been feeling. The immediate practical question Alice had been confronting had been whether the revelation about her marriage's invalidity would affect her homestead claim, which she'd filed under the name Alice Brennan and which she'd been proving for nearly 2 years. The concern had been significant enough that Alice had decided to consult with a lawyer in McCook to understand the legal implications of discovering that her marriage had been void and that her use of the surname Brennan might not have been legally appropriate. Several days after receiving Thomas's letter, Alice had made the journey back to McCook, specifically to meet with George Reynolds, a lawyer who'd maintained an office above the general store and who'd handled legal matters for homesteaders and townspeople throughout the region. Reynolds had been a man in his early 50s who'd practiced law in various frontier communities for more than 20 years, and he'd developed expertise in the practical legal problems that homesteaders encountered during their proving periods. Alice had explained her situation to Reynolds with embarrassment that had made the conversation difficult, and she'd shown him Thomas Brennan's letter as documentation of the claims being made about Frank's bigamy and about Alice's void marriage. Reynolds had read the letter carefully before setting it aside and asking Alice several questions about when and where she'd married Frank, about what Frank had told her regarding his previous marital status, and about whether Alice had had any suspicions that Frank might have been concealing a prior marriage. Miss, I suppose we need to determine what name to use for you, don't we? Reynolds had begun with the awkward recognition that Alice's marital status had been unclear. The fundamental issue is whether your homestead claim is valid given that you filed it under the name Alice Brennan, which you acquired through a marriage that was legally void due to Frank Brennan's prior undissolved marriage to Grace Peterson. Alice had nodded, waiting anxiously for Reynolds to continue with his analysis. The possibility that her 2 years of hardship and work might be invalidated because of Frank's bigamy had been terrifying, and Alice had been prepared to hear that she would need to abandon her claim and start over under her maiden name if the law required such action. But Reynolds had been shaking his head as though dismissing concerns that Alice had been beginning to articulate. Fortunately for you, the Homestead Act and the Land Office regulations that govern claims don't require that married women use their husband's surnames when filing claims. Many women file under their maiden names or under names they've used for years, regardless of their current marital status. The Land Office cares primarily that the claimant is the person who's actually residing on and improving the land, and that the claim is filed by someone legally entitled to claim public land under the Act's provisions. Reynolds had continued with his explanation in language that had been reassuring despite its legal complexity. You filed your claim as Alice Brennan in March of 1885, and you've maintained continuous residence on the claim since that time. The fact that you obtained the surname Brennan through a marriage that was later revealed to be void doesn't invalidate your use of that name for purposes of the homestead claim. You were using the name in good faith based on what you believed to be a valid marriage, and the Land Office has no reason to question the claim based on subsequent discoveries about your marital status. Alice had felt enormous relief at Reynolds' assessment, but she'd wanted to make certain she'd understood the implications correctly. So I can continue proving the claim under the name Alice Brennan, even though my marriage to Frank wasn't valid and I'm not legally entitled to use his surname. That's correct, Reynolds had confirmed. The bigger question is whether you want to continue using the Brennan name given what you now know about Frank's deception, or whether you'd prefer to revert to your maiden name and explain the situation to the Land Office. Legally, either approach would be acceptable, but there might be social considerations that would influence your decision. Alice had considered the question carefully before responding. My maiden name was Alice Peterson, and I don't particularly want to use that name because it would require explaining to everyone why I'm changing names midway through proving my claim. I think I'd rather continue as Alice Brennan and deal with whatever social consequences come from people learning that my marriage was invalid. The name doesn't mean what I thought it meant, but it's what I've been known by for nearly 4 years now, and changing it seems like it would create more complications than it would solve. Reynolds had also addressed Alice's concerns about whether she might be liable for Frank's debts that Thomas Brennan had mentioned in his letter. As to the debts Frank accumulated, you have no legal responsibility for those obligations. A bigamous marriage creates no legal relationship between the parties, which means you were never actually Frank's wife, and therefore cannot be held responsible for debts he incurred before or during your supposed marriage. Thomas Brennan's statement that he's not seeking compensation from you is legally correct. He has no grounds to collect from you, even if he wanted to attempt such collection. The consultation with Reynolds had lasted perhaps an hour, and by the time Alice had left the lawyer's office, she'd been carrying both relief about the security of her homestead claim and complicated emotions about what the legal reality of her situation meant for how she understood her own past. She'd lived as Frank's wife for nearly 2 years, had loved him, and had mourned him after his death, and had proven a homestead claim that she'd understood as completing a plan they'd made together. But if Frank had never actually been her husband, what had their relationship been? Had the love she'd felt been real, even if the marriage had been void? How should she remember Frank now that she knew he'd been deceiving her throughout their time together? The questions had been troubling enough that Alice had struggled with them during the weeks following her meeting with Reynolds, and she'd found no satisfactory answers that reconciled the Frank she'd believed she'd known with the Frank that the man Alice had loved had been honest and devoted and had been planning a future with her. The man Thomas had described had been dishonest and irresponsible and had been using Alice as an unknowing accomplice in his escape from debts and from a wife he'd abandoned. Alice had decided to write to Thomas Brennan asking for additional information about Frank's first marriage and about the circumstances that had led to Frank abandoning Grace. The act of writing the letter had been difficult because it had required Alice to acknowledge that she'd been deceived and that she needed to learn truths about Frank that he'd never shared with her. But the need to understand had been stronger than the embarrassment of admitting her ignorance, and Alice had posted the letter in early March with hopes that Thomas would be willing to provide details that might help her make sense of Frank's behavior. Thomas's response, which had arrived in late April of 1887, had been providing details that had made Alice's feelings about Frank even more complicated and conflicted. Thomas had written at length about Frank's marriage to Grace, describing how Frank and Grace had met in Cedar Rapids in 1877 and had married the following year when Frank had been 26 and Grace had been 23. According to Thomas, the marriage had been reasonably happy during its first few years, despite Frank's tendency to spend money recklessly and to engage in business ventures that had often failed and had left him in debt. The daughter born to Frank and Grace in 1879 had been named Charlotte, and Thomas had included in his letter a description of the child as a sweet-natured girl who'd resembled her mother more than her father and who'd been approximately 3 years old when Frank had abandoned the family in August of 1882. Thomas had written that Frank's abandonment had occurred suddenly and without warning, with Frank leaving one morning claiming to be traveling to a nearby town on business and simply never returning. Grace had waited for weeks expecting Frank to come back, and it had been only gradually that she'd realized he'd left permanently and had no intention of resuming his responsibilities as husband and father. Thomas had written that Frank's abandonment had been motivated primarily by his desire to escape creditors who'd been pursuing him for payment of debts he'd accumulated through failed business ventures and through personal spending he couldn't afford. Frank had apparently believed that leaving Cedar Rapids and starting fresh somewhere else under circumstances where his creditors couldn't find him would be easier than attempting to repay his debts or facing legal consequences for his financial irresponsibility. The pattern Thomas had been describing, running from problems rather than confronting them, prioritizing his own immediate needs over obligations to others, using deception to avoid consequences, had been consistent with the Frank who'd married Alice bigamously and who'd concealed from her the existence of a wife and daughter he'd left behind in Iowa. The most disturbing aspect of Thomas's account had been his revelation that Frank's death in February of 1885 hadn't been a simple accident, as Alice had been told. According to information Thomas had gathered from witnesses who'd seen Frank shortly before his death, Frank had been traveling rapidly through western Iowa in what appeared to be an attempt to evade someone who'd been following him, possibly a law enforcement officer or a creditor's agent. Frank had died when his horse had stumbled while being ridden at excessive speed at night, throwing Frank and causing injuries that had killed him within hours. Thomas had suggested that Frank's rush to reach Nebraska and to file a homestead claim had been motivated partly by the legal protections that homestead property had enjoyed under federal law, which had made proven homesteads difficult for creditors to seize, even when homesteaders had owed substantial debts. Frank had apparently believed that proving a homestead would provide him with assets that would be protected from the creditors he'd been fleeing, and that starting over in a new territory where his past was unknown would allow him to escape the consequences of his financial and personal irresponsibility in Iowa. The information Thomas had been providing had been transforming Alice's understanding of Frank from a man she'd loved and mourned to someone who'd been fundamentally dishonest and who'd been using Alice as an unwitting participant in his schemes to escape his past. The realization that Frank had never loved her in the way she'd believed, but had instead married her bigamously as part of his plan to start fresh in Nebraska, had been painful in ways that Frank's death itself hadn't been. When Alice had grieved for Frank after his death, she'd been mourning a husband and partner who she'd believed had loved her and had been building a future with her. Now she was grieving for the loss of that belief and for the recognition that the relationship she'd valued had been based on lies. But Thomas's letter had also included information about Grace that had been providing Alice with unexpected comfort and perspective. Thomas had written that Grace had initially been devastated by Frank's abandonment, but had eventually come to view his departure as a blessing that had freed her from a marriage to someone who'd been irresponsible and dishonest. Grace had supported herself and Charlotte through work as a seamstress, and she'd eventually obtained a divorce from Frank in 1886 after Iowa law had changed to permit divorce on grounds of willful desertion. Grace had remarried in late 1886 to a man named Edward Walsh, who'd been a widower with 2 children of his own. And by the time Thomas had been writing to Alice in early 1887, Grace had been happily settled in a second marriage that had been far more stable and satisfying than her marriage to Frank had ever been. Thomas had included Grace's address in his letter and had suggested that Alice might want to write to Grace if she'd been interested in corresponding with the woman who'd been Frank's legal wife during the years when Alice had believed herself to be married to Frank. The suggestion had seemed strange at first. Why would Alice want to communicate with Frank's first wife? But as Alice had thought about it over several days, she'd begun to recognize that Grace was perhaps the only person who could truly understand what Alice was experiencing in learning about Frank's deceptions. Alice had written to Grace in May of 1887, introducing herself and explaining that she'd recently learned about Frank's first marriage and about the fact that Alice's own supposed marriage to Frank had been bigamous and void. Alice had been uncertain how Grace would respond to a letter from the woman Frank had married while still legally bound to Grace, but she'd felt compelled to reach out to someone who'd shared the experience of being deceived by Frank, even if their circumstances had been different in important ways. The letter Alice had sent to Grace had been among the most difficult pieces of correspondence she'd ever written, requiring her to explain circumstances that were embarrassing and painful, while also expressing sympathy for what Grace had endured during and after her marriage to Frank. Alice had written about how she'd learned of Grace's existence through Thomas's letter, about her shock at discovering that her marriage had been void, and about her complicated feelings toward Frank now that she understood he'd been deceiving her throughout their relationship. Alice had also written about her homesteading and about how Frank's shotgun had become her primary means of survival, creating an ironic situation where the one valuable thing Frank had left behind had become the tool Alice used to build a life Frank had never intended for her to have. Grace's response, which had arrived in early June, had been warm and sympathetic in ways that had surprised Alice, and that had begun what would become an unlikely but genuine friendship between 2 women whose lives had been shaped by the same dishonest man. Grace had written that she'd felt no anger toward Alice for having married Frank, because Grace had understood that Alice had been deceived just as Grace herself had been deceived during her marriage. Grace had expressed sympathy for Alice's current circumstances as a woman attempting to prove a homestead alone, and she'd praised Alice's determination to continue despite learning difficult truths about the man Alice had thought she'd known. Grace had written at length about her own experience with Frank, describing how he'd been charming and attentive during their courtship, but had become increasingly irresponsible and secretive after they'd married. Grace had told Alice about the failed business ventures that had left the family in debt, about Frank's tendency to blame others for his problems rather than taking responsibility for his choices, and about the gradual erosion of trust that had occurred during their marriage as Grace had realized that Frank's promises were often empty and that his explanations for his behavior were frequently lies. The most valuable aspect of Grace's letter for Alice had been Grace's insight that Frank's deceptions hadn't been personal failures on the part of the women he'd deceived to recognize warning signs, but rather had been consistent with patterns of behavior Frank had established long before either Grace or Alice had met him. Grace had written that Frank had been skilled at presenting himself as whatever the person he was talking to wanted him to be, and that this ability to mirror others' expectations had made him seem trustworthy even when he'd been lying. Both Grace and Alice had fallen in love with versions of Frank that he'd created for their benefit, and both had been deceived because Frank had been skilled at deception rather than because either woman had been particularly gullible or naive. The correspondence between Alice and Grace during the summer and autumn of 1887 had been providing both women with emotional support and with perspectives they couldn't have obtained elsewhere. Alice had learned from Grace's letters that Frank had been using similar patterns in both his marriages, presenting himself as devoted and reliable during courtship, becoming more distant and secretive after marriage, accumulating debts he couldn't repay, and eventually fleeing rather than facing consequences for his behavior. The consistency of the pattern across both marriages had been helping Alice understand that Frank's treatment of her hadn't been unique or particularly targeted, but rather had been how Frank interacted with everyone when his interests had conflicted with his obligations. For Grace, corresponding with Alice had been providing a form of closure about her first marriage, and had been allowing her to help someone who was experiencing difficulties similar to what Grace herself had endured years earlier. Grace had written that knowing Alice was successfully proving a homestead despite the hardships Frank had left behind had been inspiring to her, and that she admired Alice's strength and determination in circumstances that would have defeated many people. Grace had also written that her current marriage to Edward Walsh had taught her what a genuine partnership between equals looked like, and that comparing her marriage to Edward with her marriage to Frank had made her realize how much she'd been settling for less than she'd deserved when she'd believed Frank's promises and had trusted his commitment to their marriage. The community response to Alice's revelation about her marriage to Frank had been mixed when Alice had decided to be honest about what she'd learned rather than attempting to hide the truth. Alice had recognized that secrets had a way of being discovered eventually in small frontier communities, and she'd preferred to control the narrative by being forthright rather than allowing rumors and speculation to define her situation. Walter and Louise Kemp had been among the first neighbors Alice had told about the letter from Thomas and about the discovery that her marriage to Frank had been void. Louise had visited Alice's dugout shortly after Alice had learned the truth, and her response had been sympathetic and supportive in ways that had helped Alice begin processing the emotional impact of the revelations. "Mrs. Brennan, or Miss Peterson, or whatever name you prefer, you've proven yourself to be a capable and determined homesteader, regardless of what Frank Brennan lied about or hid from you," Louise had said during her visit. "The women in this community who matter know that you were deceived and that you've handled a terrible situation with grace and honesty. Anyone who judges you harshly for Frank's dishonesty isn't worth worrying about." But not all community members had been as charitable in their reactions as Louise had been. Some neighbors had suggested that Alice should have known Frank was hiding something, and that her failure to recognize his deceptions suggested poor judgment or naivety that raised questions about her general competence. A few women had whispered that Alice's supposed marriage to Frank had been immoral even though Alice had believed the marriage to be valid, and these whispers had been creating social discomfort that Alice had needed to navigate carefully. The most painful aspect of the community response had been the subtle shift in how some people had treated Alice after learning about the bigamy. Before the revelation, Alice had been the widow Brennan who'd been proving a claim alone after losing her husband, a status that had commanded sympathy and respect, even from people who doubted Alice's ability to succeed. After the revelation, Alice had been the woman who was fooled by Frank Brennan, or the woman whose marriage wasn't legal, descriptions that had implied gullibility or impropriety, even though Alice had done nothing wrong and had been Frank's victim rather than his accomplice. The discovery that her marriage had been void had also been raising questions about Alice's identity and about how she should think of herself going forward. Was she a widow whose husband had died, or was she a single woman who'd never been legally married? Should she continue using the Brennan surname, or should she revert to her maiden name of Peterson? Should she tell people she'd been married to Frank, even though the marriage had been legally invalid, or should she describe herself as having been deceived into a bigamous relationship? Alice had eventually decided that the most honest approach was to continue using the name Alice Brennan and to explain when relevant that she'd been married to Frank Brennan in a marriage she'd believed to be valid, but that had later been revealed to be bigamous due to Frank's prior undissolved marriage. The explanation had been awkward and had required more detail than simple declarations of widowhood would have needed, but Alice had preferred honesty and complexity over simplicity that would have required deception or concealment. The agricultural work Alice had been continuing during 1887 and 1888 had been providing welcome distraction from the emotional difficulties of processing Frank's deceptions and of managing community reactions to her situation. Alice had expanded her cultivation to approximately 16 acres during the spring of 1887, and she'd continued hunting with Frank's shotgun to provide meat and to generate trade goods that could be exchanged for supplies and ammunition. The harvest of 1887 had been yielding approximately 60 bushels of wheat and 40 bushels of corn, generating income of approximately $35 after reserving seed for future planting. The increased income had been allowing Alice to purchase additional ammunition and to begin accumulating small savings that would provide security against future emergencies or crop failures. The success had been satisfying, not just because it had been improving Alice's financial situation, but also because it had been demonstrating that Alice could build a productive farm through her own labor and skill, despite the difficulties Frank's deceptions had created. By the spring of 1888, Alice had been approaching the 4th year of her proving period, with growing confidence that she would successfully complete the 5-year requirement, despite the challenges she'd faced, and despite the emotional turmoil of learning about Frank's deceptions. The shotgun that had been so critical to her survival continued to hang on the dugout wall as a reminder both of Frank's betrayal and of Alice's own resourcefulness in using the one valuable thing he'd left behind to build a life he'd never intended for her to have. The agricultural season of 1888 had been Alice's most successful yet, with favorable weather and accumulated experience allowing her to achieve yields that approached what established farmers with proper equipment had been producing. Alice had expanded her cultivation to 18 acres and had harvested approximately 85 bushels of wheat and 55 bushels of corn, generating income of approximately $48 after seed reserves. The improved financial circumstances had been allowing Alice to make long-postponed improvements to her dugout and to begin thinking seriously about what she would do after receiving her patent in March of 1890. Would she continue farming the homestead indefinitely, or would she sell the proven claim and use the proceeds to pursue other opportunities? Would she consider remarrying if appropriate prospects presented themselves, or would Frank's deceptions have made her too cautious to trust another man enough to consider marriage? These questions had remained unanswered as Alice had entered the final year of her proving period in the spring of 1889. But the fact that she'd been able to contemplate such questions from a position of success rather than from desperation or failure had been representing a triumph that Frank's deceptions couldn't diminish. Alice had proven that she could survive alone, that she could build a productive farm through her own labor, and that Frank's lies about who he was and what he'd promised hadn't been able to destroy the life Alice had been building for herself. The final year of Alice's proving period during 1889 had been characterized by a sense of approaching completion that had been both satisfying and bittersweet, as Alice had contemplated the transformation she'd undergone during the 5 years since filing her claim in March of 1885. The woman who'd arrived at the homestead with nothing but a shotgun and $15 had been desperate, grieving, and uncertain whether she could survive even a single season alone on the frontier. The woman approaching her prove-up inspection in early 1890 had been competent, self-sufficient, and respected within the community as someone who'd overcome extraordinary challenges through determination and resourcefulness. The agricultural work Alice had undertaken during the spring and summer of 1889 had been her most ambitious yet, with cultivation expanded to 20 acres that represented the practical limit of what one person could manage through hand labor without animal power or mechanical equipment. Alice had been breaking an additional 2 acres during April and May, bringing her total cultivated land to the 20-acre threshold that marked serious agricultural commitment beyond subsistence farming. The physical labor of breaking sod had become no easier despite 5 years of experience, and Alice had found that the accumulated fatigue of 5 years of intensive manual work had been making each season's expansion slightly more difficult than the previous year's efforts had been. Her hands bore permanent calluses from years of gripping spade and hoe handles. Her shoulders and back carried the constant low ache that came from repetitive heavy labor, and her body had developed the wiry strength that characterized people who'd spent years performing physical work that pushed the limits of human endurance. But the physical toll had been accompanied by a corresponding increase in agricultural skill and efficiency that had made Alice's farming operations far more productive than they'd been during her early proving years. She'd learned through experience and through observation of neighboring homesteads which techniques worked best in local soil and climate conditions, how to time planting to optimize growing seasons, which seed varieties produced most reliably, and how to manage the endless small decisions that accumulated into successful or failed harvests. The planting of 1889 had been proceeding smoothly, with accumulated experience, guiding Alice's decisions about seed selection, planting depth, and spacing that would optimize yields while remaining manageable for her limited labor capacity. The shotgun had continued to play its essential role in Alice's survival strategy, providing fresh meat that supplemented her grain-based diet and that could be traded to neighbors for supplies or services that Alice couldn't provide for herself. By this point in her homesteading, Alice had become known throughout the district as an exceptional hunter whose skill with Frank's 12-gauge shotgun had exceeded what most men could achieve. The reputation had been based on years of practice, motivated by the harsh reality that wasted ammunition meant wasted money and potentially missed meals, and the discipline had transformed Alice into a marksman who could reliably take rabbits at 30 yards, prairie chickens in flight, and deer with carefully placed shots that minimized suffering while maximizing meat recovery. The hunting had become more than just a practical necessity for Alice. It had become a source of pride and accomplishment that provided satisfaction independent of its economic benefits. There was something deeply gratifying about the moment when careful stalking and patient waiting culminated in a clean shot that brought down game, about the knowledge that her skill was feeding her and was earning respect from neighbors who'd initially doubted that a woman could master the shotgun well enough to hunt successfully. Walter Kemp had commented during one of his visits to Alice's homestead in the summer of 1889 that Alice had become the most skilled hunter in the district regardless of gender, and that several men who'd been hunting for decades couldn't match her consistency or her efficiency with ammunition. The praise had been particularly meaningful because it had been coming from someone who'd initially doubted Alice's ability to survive at all, and whose respect had been earned through 5 years of observing Alice's competence rather than being granted based on assumptions about what women could or couldn't accomplish. The harvest of 1889 had been yielding approximately 100 bushels of wheat and 65 bushels of corn from the 20 acres Alice had cultivated, representing her best production to date and generating income of approximately $60 after reserving seed for potential future planting. The $60 income had been substantial enough that Alice had been able to purchase not just ammunition, but also a used hand-pulled plow that would allow her to break sod more efficiently if she'd chosen to expand cultivation beyond 20 acres in future years. The accumulating success of Alice's agricultural efforts during her 5 years of proving had been creating financial security that would have seemed impossible when she'd started, and the contrast between her current circumstances and her desperate situation in March of 1885 had been dramatic enough that Alice had sometimes felt as though she were remembering someone else's life rather than her own experiences from just 5 years earlier. The $15 she'd possessed when filing her claim had seemed like a fortune at the time, because it had been all she'd had, but now Alice had savings of more than $100 accumulated from successful harvests and from careful management of limited resources over multiple growing seasons. But the psychological effects of learning about Frank's deceptions and about the invalidity of her marriage had been continuing to affect Alice in ways that weren't resolved simply by agricultural or financial success. The question of her identity, was she Alice Brennan the widow or Alice Peterson the deceived woman who'd never been legally married, had remained uncomfortable and had required constant navigation in social situations where people had asked about her marital status or her background. Alice had developed a standard explanation she'd used when the topic arose with people who didn't already know her history. I was married to Frank Brennan in a marriage I believed to be valid, but I later learned that Frank had been previously married and had never divorced his first wife, which meant my marriage was void. Frank died in 1885, and I've been proving this homestead alone since then, using the name Alice Brennan, which I continue to use despite the marriage having been invalid. The explanation had been honest and had conveyed the essential facts without requiring lengthy elaboration, but it had also been marking Alice as someone with a complicated past that invited questions and speculation. Some people had been satisfied with the brief explanation and had asked no further questions, while others had wanted details about how Alice had discovered the truth, about what had happened to Frank's first wife, and about whether Alice felt angry or betrayed by Frank's deceptions. The most persistent questions had come from well-meaning neighbors who'd seemed unable to understand why Alice continued using the Brennan surname if her marriage to Frank had been void, and if she discovered that Frank had been dishonest and had abandoned a previous wife and child. The logic seemed clear to these neighbors. If the marriage had been invalid, then Alice should revert to her maiden name and should distance herself from any association with Frank or his deceptions. But Alice had found that her reasons for continuing to use the Brennan name were more complicated than simple logic could address. The name had become part of her identity during 5 years of using it, and it was the name under which she'd built a reputation as a successful homesteader and skilled hunter. Changing back to Peterson would have required explaining the change to everyone she encountered, and it would have felt like allowing Frank's deceptions to erase 5 years of Alice's life and accomplishments. By keeping the Brennan name, Alice was asserting that her identity and her achievements belonged to her regardless of the circumstances under which she'd acquired the surname, and that Frank's lies didn't have the power to define who she was or what she'd accomplished. The prove-up inspection that would determine whether Alice would receive her patent had been conducted in February of 1890 by a land office inspector named William Crawford, who'd traveled from the district office to examine Alice's claim and to interview her about her 5 years of homesteading. Crawford had been a man in his late 40s who'd been conducting homestead inspections for more than a decade, and he'd developed a practiced eye for distinguishing between legitimate proving efforts and fraudulent claims that had attempted to satisfy legal requirements through minimal compliance rather than genuine agricultural development. Crawford's examination of Alice's homestead had been thorough and had included inspection of the dugout, measurement of the cultivated acreage, assessment of improvements Alice had made to the property, and detailed questioning about her agricultural production, her sources of income, and her methods of survival during 5 years of proving the claim alone. The inspection had taken most of a day, with Crawford walking the boundaries of Alice's cultivated fields, examining the condition of her dugout and outbuildings, and asking detailed questions about crop rotations, seed sources, harvest yields, and the disposition of agricultural production over multiple growing seasons. The interview had included questions about Alice's marital status that had required her to explain the circumstances of her supposed marriage to Frank and the subsequent discovery that the marriage had been void. Crawford had listened to Alice's explanation without visible reaction, making notes on the forms he'd been completing, while Alice had described how she'd learned of Frank's bigamy through a letter from his brother, and how she'd consulted with a lawyer about the implications for her homestead claim. "Miss Peterson, or do you prefer Mrs. Brennan? I need to understand your marital status for purposes of completing my inspection report," Crawford had said after Alice had finished her explanation. The claim was filed under the name Alice Brennan in March of 1885, and you've indicated that you believed yourself to be a widow at the time of filing. But you've also explained that you subsequently learned your marriage was invalid due to your husband's prior undissolved marriage. How should I classify your status for official purposes? Alice had been expecting the question and had prepared her response carefully. I filed the claim as Alice Brennan, which is the name I was using in March of 1885, based on what I believe to be a valid marriage to Frank Brennan. I've continued using that name throughout my proving period, and I'd prefer to receive the patent under the name Alice Brennan if that's acceptable. As to my marital status, I suppose the most accurate description would be that I'm an unmarried woman who was deceived into a bigamous relationship that I believed to be a legitimate marriage." Crawford had nodded thoughtfully and had made notes on the forms he'd been completing. The land office has encountered similar situations before. Cases where homesteaders discovered that their understanding of their own marital status was incorrect due to deceptions or misunderstandings. The general policy has been to evaluate claims based on whether the claimant acted in good faith and met the substantive requirements for proving, rather than disqualifying claims based on technical issues about names or marital classifications that weren't within the claimant's control. Crawford had continued his assessment with observations that had made clear he'd been impressed by what Alice had accomplished, despite circumstances that would have defeated most homesteaders. In your case, you've clearly maintained continuous residence on this claim for 5 years. You've cultivated approximately 20 acres. You've made substantial improvements, including construction of a dwelling and development of agricultural infrastructure, and you've generated agricultural production that demonstrates genuine farming rather than minimal compliance with the law. Your use of the name Alice Brennan appears to have been in good faith based on what you believed about your marital status, and the subsequent discovery that your marriage was invalid doesn't change the fact that you've proven this claim through your own labor and determination. The inspector's assessment had been reassuring, and Alice had felt the tension she'd been carrying about whether the complications of her marital status might disqualify her claim beginning to dissipate, as Crawford had. "I'm going to recommend approval of your patent under the name Alice Brennan, with a notation in the records that the claimant's marital status was subject to subsequent clarification regarding the validity of her marriage to Frank Brennan. The patent will grant you ownership of this quarter section in your own right as an individual claimant, and your marital status, past, present, or future, won't affect that ownership once the patent is issued." Crawford had paused before adding a personal observation that had gone beyond the formal requirements of his inspection. "Miss Brennan, I've been inspecting homestead claims for more than 10 years, and I've seen thousands of homesteaders attempt to prove land under every imaginable circumstance. What you've accomplished here is remarkable, not just because you've succeeded where many people with more resources have failed, but because you've done it while dealing with personal circumstances that would have provided legitimate justification for abandoning the effort. The fact that you persisted, despite learning that your marriage was void, and that the man you trusted had been deceiving you, demonstrates the kind of character and determination that the Homestead Act was designed to reward. You should be proud of what you've accomplished. The patent had been issued in March of 1890, exactly 5 years after Alice had filed her claim, and the document had been confirming Alice's ownership of 160 acres of land that she'd transformed from unimproved prairie into a functioning farm through 5 years of sustained effort under circumstances that would have defeated most people. The patent had been made out to Alice Brennan, single woman, which had been reflecting the land office's determination that Alice's void marriage meant she should be classified as unmarried rather than as a widow. But the classification had been less important than the fundamental fact of ownership. Alice had received the patent document on a cold morning in late March when she'd traveled to McCook to collect it from the land office, and she'd stood outside the office for several minutes after receiving the paper, looking at the official seals and signatures that confirmed what she'd been working toward for 5 years. The quarter section was hers, not hers and Frank's, but hers alone. The land belonged to Alice Brennan, single woman, who'd proven it through her own labor, and who would own it regardless of what lies she'd been told, or what truths she'd discovered about the man who'd left her nothing but a shotgun and a legacy of deception. Alice had visited Frank's grave on the day she'd received her patent. She'd buried him on the homestead shortly after his death, before learning the truth about his bigamy, and the grave had remained as a marker of her complicated history with the man whose lies had shaped 5 years of her life. Alice had stood at the simple wooden cross that marked where Frank was buried, and had spoken to him as though he could somehow hear her words from wherever the dead resided. "I proved the claim, Frank. The quarter section you plan to take is now mine, Not ours because we were never actually married, but mine alone. You left me nothing except that shotgun and a pack of lies, but I used what you left to build something you never intended for me to have. I don't know if you loved me or if I was just convenient for your plans to escape Iowa, but it doesn't matter anymore. You're dead, and I'm alive, and I own land that no one can take from me regardless of what lies you told or what truths you hid." The words had been providing a form of closure that Alice hadn't known she'd needed, and walking back to the dugout from Frank's grave had felt like crossing a threshold between a past defined by Frank's deceptions and a future defined by Alice's own choices and accomplishments. The shotgun that had been Frank's legacy to her would remain important as a tool and as a reminder of how much she'd built from so little. But Frank himself was now part of a past that had been processed and understood, rather than a present that continued to shape Alice's identity and choices. The summer of 1890 had been bringing an unexpected development that would provide Alice with deeper understanding of the woman whose life had been entangled with her own through Frank's bigamy. Grace Walsh, formerly Grace Brennan and before that Grace Peterson, had written to Alice in June proposing that she visit Nebraska to meet Alice in person and to see the homestead Alice had proven. Grace had explained that she'd been curious about Alice since their correspondence had begun 3 years earlier, and that she'd wanted to meet the woman who'd shared the experience of being married to Frank, even if their legal relationships to him had been different. Alice had been uncertain about whether meeting Grace would be healing or painful, but curiosity and a desire for closure had led her to invite Grace to visit in August, when agricultural work would be less demanding and when Alice would have time to spend with a guest. Grace had traveled to Nebraska by train, and Alice had met her at the McCook Depot on a warm afternoon in mid-August, when the prairie had been at its most beautiful, with wildflowers blooming and the wheat harvest recently completed. The two women had recognized each other immediately despite never having met, perhaps because they'd both been looking for someone who appeared to be searching for connection. Grace had been 35 years old, 3 years older than Alice, and she'd been accompanied by Charlotte, her daughter from her marriage to Frank, who'd been 11 years old and who'd been curious about the woman her mother had been corresponding with for more than 3 years. The visit had lasted 3 days, during which Alice had shown Grace the homestead, had explained how she'd survived 5 years of proving alone, and had shared the dugout with Grace and Charlotte in accommodations that had been cramped, but that had been sufficient for the short visit. The conversations between Alice and Grace had been ranging across topics, including their respective experiences with Frank, their current lives, and their perspectives on marriage, independence, and the choices women made to survive in circumstances that often provided limited options. Grace had been fascinated by the shotgun hanging on the dugout wall, and Alice had explained its central role in her survival and in her ability to prove the claim. "Frank left me almost nothing when he died, $15, some basic supplies, and this 12-gauge shotgun. But that shotgun has been the difference between success and failure over these 5 years. It's fed me, protected me, earned income through trading meat, and reminded me constantly that I could survive with very little as long as I used well what I had." Grace had asked whether Alice resented Frank for the deceptions he'd perpetrated, and Alice's response had been reflecting years of processing complicated emotions about the man she'd believed she'd married. "I did resent him terribly when I first learned the truth. The anger was consuming for months. But over time I've come to see that Frank's greatest gift to me, even if he didn't intend it, was forcing me to discover that I could survive alone. If our marriage had been valid, and if Frank had lived, I would have spent my life dependent on a man who was fundamentally dishonest and irresponsible. His death and the discovery of his bigamy forced me to become self-sufficient in ways I never would have become otherwise. I own land now, 160 acres that are mine alone, that no husband can claim, that no one can take from me. Frank didn't intend to give me that, but his lies and his death made it possible." Grace had understood Alice's perspective because she'd undergone a similar transformation in her own thinking about Frank and about what his abandonment had ultimately meant for her life. "When Frank left me in 1882, I thought my life was over. I was a woman with a small child and no husband in an era when a woman's value was measured largely by her marital status. But his leaving forced me to support myself, which taught me skills and gave me confidence I'd never had when I was married to him and dependent on his unreliable income. When I eventually remarried, I chose Edward carefully and deliberately rather than marrying out of necessity or social pressure. I'm happier now than I ever was with Frank, and I wouldn't have this life if he hadn't abandoned me. The conversation between the two women had been creating a bond based on shared recognition that sometimes the worst things that happened could lead to unexpected growth and strength, and that victimhood wasn't the only possible response to being deceived or abandoned. Both women had been victims of Frank's dishonesty, but both had also transcended victimhood to become women who'd built lives on their own terms, despite circumstances that had seemed devastating when they'd first occurred. Charlotte had been listening to the conversations between her mother and Alice with the serious attention of a child who was beginning to understand adult complexities, and on the final evening of the visit, she'd asked Alice a question that had revealed she'd been processing what she'd been hearing during the 3 days in the dugout. "Miss Brennan, did you love my father? I mean, before you knew about the lies he told?" Alice had considered the question carefully before responding, wanting to be honest with Charlotte while also being mindful that Charlotte was Frank's daughter and might have complicated feelings about a man she'd barely known. "I believed I loved the man I thought your father was, the man he presented himself as when we met and married. But I don't know if I actually loved your father as he really was, because I never knew that person. The Frank I thought I married was honest and reliable and was devoted to building a life with me. The real Frank was dishonest and irresponsible and was using me for purposes I didn't understand. So I suppose the answer is that I loved an illusion, and when the illusion was revealed to be false, the love disappeared because it had been based on lies." Charlotte had nodded as though Alice's answer had made sense to her. "Mother says I shouldn't hate my father because he was weak rather than evil, and because hating him would hurt me more than it would hurt his memory. But I don't think I loved him either, because I barely remember him. Is it wrong that I don't miss him or feel sad that he's dead?" The question had been heartbreaking in its honesty, and Alice had wanted to reassure Charlotte that her feelings were valid and understandable. It's not wrong to feel however you actually feel about your father. You were 3 years old when he left, which means you don't really remember him beyond fragments and stories other people have told you. You can't miss someone you never really knew, and you can't mourn someone who chose to abandon you. Your father made choices that hurt you and your mother, and you're not obligated to love him or forgive him or feel sad about his death just because he was your father. Grace had thanked Alice for the conversation with Charlotte, explaining that Charlotte had been struggling with feelings about Frank that she'd been afraid to express to her mother for fear of causing pain. The 3 days at Alice's homestead had been providing Charlotte with perspective from someone who'd also been hurt by Frank, but who'd been willing to discuss him honestly rather than pretending he'd been better than he'd actually been. When Grace and Charlotte had departed for Iowa at the end of the visit, Alice had felt both sadness at seeing them leave and gratitude for the connection they'd formed during the brief time together. The correspondence between Alice and Grace had continued after the visit, and over the years, it had evolved into a friendship that had been based on mutual respect and shared understanding rather than on the traumatic connection to Frank that had initially brought them into contact. The years following Alice's patent approval in 1890 had been characterized by continued agricultural production and by gradual improvements to Alice's homestead that had transformed it from a minimal proving operation into a well-established farm. Alice had purchased a horse in 1891 using savings accumulated from several good harvests, and the animal power had been allowing her to expand cultivation beyond the 20-acre limit that hand labor had imposed, and to break ground more efficiently than had been possible with hand tools alone. The horse had been an older mare that Alice had purchased for $45 from a neighbor who'd been upgrading his livestock, and while the animal hadn't been particularly fast or strong, she'd been steady and reliable and had been transforming Alice's farming capacity in ways that justified the investment. With the horse pulling the hand plow Alice had purchased the previous year, breaking sod became a task that could be accomplished in hours rather than days, and the expansion of cultivation from 20 acres to 30 acres that Alice had undertaken during the early 1890s would have been impossible without animal power to supplement human labor. By the mid-1890s, Alice had been cultivating approximately 30 acres, and had been generating annual incomes of $80 to $100 that had provided comfortable living by frontier standards, and that had allowed her to make improvements to her dwelling and her farm infrastructure that would have been impossible during her early proving years. The dugout had been expanded with an additional room excavated into the hillside, providing separate sleeping quarters that made the dwelling feel less cramped and more like a permanent home rather than temporary shelter. Alice had also constructed a small barn to house her horse and to provide storage for equipment and for harvested grain. And she'd built a chicken coop that allowed her to raise poultry for eggs and meat. The accumulation of these improvements over years of successful farming had been creating a homestead that looked established and prosperous rather than marginal and struggling, and visitors to Alice's property had often commented that her farm appeared better maintained and more productive than many homesteads that had been proven by families rather than by single women working alone. The question of remarriage had been one that Alice had contemplated periodically during the years after receiving her patent, and several men in the district had expressed interest in courting her once she'd been established as a successful landowner. But Alice had been cautious about marriage in ways she wouldn't have been before learning about Frank's deceptions, and she'd been unwilling to remarry unless she'd been confident that any potential husband would respect her ownership of the homestead and wouldn't attempt to assert control over property. Alice had proven through her own labor. The legal reality that married women's property rights varied significantly depending on state law and on the specific terms under which marriages were contracted had made Alice particularly careful about considering remarriage. She'd consulted with George Reynolds, the lawyer who'd advised her about the implications of Frank's bigamy for her homestead claim, about what legal protections she could establish if she decided to remarry. Reynolds had explained that separate property agreements could be established before marriage that would preserve Alice's ownership of her homestead regardless of what happened during or after the marriage, and that such agreements were becoming increasingly common as women who'd established independent property ownership sought to protect their assets when entering marriages. The conversation had been reassuring in confirming that remarriage wouldn't necessarily require surrendering the independence and property ownership that had become central to Alice's sense of identity. Alice had eventually married in 1895 to a man named Samuel Worth, who'd been a widower with a proven homestead of his own approximately 10 miles from Alice's land. Samuel had been 42 years old when he'd begun courting Alice, and he'd been forthright about his circumstances and his expectations in ways that had created trust, where Frank's charm and evasiveness had created only deception. Samuel had been married previously to a woman who died in childbirth in 1892, and he'd been raising 2 daughters, aged 8 and 6, alone, while managing his farm and attempting to maintain a household that had been suffering from the absence of a woman's labor and attention. His interest in marrying Alice had been based partly on practical recognition that combining households would benefit both of them. Alice would gain assistance with heavy farm labor, and Samuel would gain help managing his household and raising his daughters, but also on genuine affection and respect that had developed during months of courtship. The marriage had been based on practical compatibility and mutual respect, rather than on passionate romance, and both Alice and Samuel had been explicit about maintaining separate ownership of their respective homesteads, rather than merging property in ways that would complicate inheritance or that would give either spouse control over land the other had proven independently. The legal agreement they'd established before marrying had specified that Alice would retain full ownership of her quarter section and Samuel would retain ownership of his, and that neither spouse would have claims on the other's property in the event of divorce or death. The arrangement had been unusual enough that it had generated some community comment, with several neighbors suggesting that a marriage without shared property wasn't a real marriage, and that Alice and Samuel were creating unnecessary complications by refusing to merge their assets. But both Alice and Samuel had been satisfied with the arrangement, and the practical benefits of the marriage had been substantial enough to justify whatever social awkwardness the separate property agreement had created. The marriage to Samuel had been providing Alice with companionship and with shared labor that had made farming easier while preserving the independence and property ownership that had been central to Alice's sense of identity. Samuel had respected Alice's attachment to the homestead she'd proven alone, and had never suggested that she should abandon her land to live solely on his property. Instead, they'd maintained both homesteads as separate operations while coordinating labor and sharing resources in ways that benefited both properties. Alice and Samuel had divided their time between the two homesteads, depending on seasonal labor demands, with Alice spending more time at her property during planting and harvest, while Samuel had been managing his own agricultural operations on a similar schedule. The arrangement had required more travel and coordination than a conventional marriage where both spouses had lived on a single property, but it had worked well for both of them through years of marriage that had been characterized by partnership and mutual support rather than by the kind of dependency that had defined many frontier marriages. The shotgun that had been so critical to Alice's survival during her proving years had been gradually retired from active use as Alice's circumstances had improved and as purchasing meat or hunting with a rifle had become more practical than relying on the aging 12-gauge that had served her so well for so long. But Alice had kept the weapon prominently displayed in her home as a reminder of the years when it had been the difference between survival and failure, and she'd told its story to anyone who'd asked about the old double barrel hanging on the wall. Samuel's daughters had been fascinated by the shotgun and by the stories Alice had told about using it to hunt during her years of proving the homestead alone, and Alice had taught both girls to shoot using the weapon that had fed her during her most desperate years. The lessons had been about more than marksmanship. They'd been about self-sufficiency and about the importance of knowing that survival was possible even in circumstances that seemed impossible, and about not allowing others to define what women could or couldn't accomplish. Alice had lived on her homestead for more than 40 years after receiving her patent in 1890, continuing to farm the land she'd proven and to build a life that had been shaped by her own choices rather than by circumstances others had imposed on her. Samuel had died in 1923, and Alice had continued managing both homesteads for several years afterward, before eventually selling Samuel's property and consolidating her farming operations on the land she'd proven as a single woman with nothing but a shotgun and determination. She'd died in 1931 at age 78, having outlived both Frank and Samuel and having achieved a level of independence and security that would have seemed impossible to the desperate 32-year-old woman who'd filed a homestead claim with nothing but a shotgun and determination. The land she'd proven had remained productive throughout her life, and she'd been buried on the homestead next to Frank's grave, a final irony that the woman who'd discovered Frank's lies was spending eternity beside the man who'd deceived her. The shotgun Alice had used to prove her claim had been donated after her death to a historical society that had been collecting artifacts related to homesteading and frontier women's history, and it had been displayed with a placard that had read, "Used by Alice Brennan to prove homestead claim 1885-1890. Only significant asset left to her by husband Frank Brennan, whose bigamous marriage to Alice was later revealed to be void. Alice used this weapon to hunt, to trade, and to survive 5 years of proving land alone. The shotgun fed her, protected her, and enabled her to build a life from the ruins of deception." The story of Alice Brennan had become a reminder that frontier women's experiences had been far more complex than simple narratives of supportive wives and happy families suggested, and that many women had built lives through resourcefulness and determination in circumstances that had been shaped by deception, abandonment, or tragedy. The shotgun and the letter had both been revealing truths. The shotgun proving that survival was possible with minimal resources and maximum determination, and the letter revealing that the past was often more complicated than it appeared, and that truth, however painful, was preferable to living within comfortable lies. Grace Walsh had outlived Alice by several years, and when she'd learned of Alice's death, she'd traveled to Nebraska one final time to visit the homestead where she'd spent 3 days, more than 40 years earlier, meeting the woman who'd been deceived by the same man who'd deceived Grace. Standing at Alice's grave, Grace had reflected on how both women had been transformed by Frank's deceptions in ways he'd never intended and could never have predicted, and how the worst thing that had happened to both of them had ultimately given them strength and independence they might never have developed if Frank had been the honest, reliable man he'd pretended to be. The two graves on the Nebraska prairie, Frank Brennan, who'd died fleeing his lies, and Alice Brennan, who'd built a life despite those lies, had told a story about deception and survival that had been more complex and more interesting than the simple tale of a widow proving a homestead that Alice's neighbors had initially believed they'd been witnessing. The truth, revealed through a letter and proven through 5 years of surviving with a shotgun, had been a story about how women built lives from the wreckage men left behind, and about how strength could emerge from circumstances that seemed designed only to destroy.